Hey everyone, it's Scott and welcome back to my garden. This week's format a little bit different in that I'm going to be dropping some knowledge on you about bird strikes and how they affect aircraft, and two of my good friends are going to be talking about jet engines and jet lag. Welcome to episode 3 of Ask Anything Aviation. Anyone who has travelled long haul will have suffered the curse of jet lag, and as long haul pilots we are no different. The first question this week comes from the Sonic Cruiser, and he asks if we have coping strategies for that as long haul pilots and whether flying faster would solve the problem of jet lag completely. Well, I've asked Lindsay McGregor, a good friend of mine and 747 co-pilot, to share with you the strategies that she uses and whether flying faster would help us. Lindsay?
I think how people cope with jet lag is very much an individual response. For me, as a long-haul co-pilot, I've got two main strategies that I use in order to help me get by. The first one is to plan my rest before, during and after the flight. And it could be something as simple as going to bed early the night before, or allowing myself a lie-in the day of the flight, and maybe making use of the bunk if we've got a third crew member. But for me, getting back into my normal routine after the duty I found to be the most helpful. The second strategy that I use, and this is by far the most difficult, is to resist temptation. So it's really easy on board to accept tea or coffee kind of every time that it's offered. It can be quite easy to have, your third meal at 4 o'clock in the morning. And also after we've landed, sometimes we'll go out for drinks and dinner with the crew. And again, what you really need is to have a good night's sleep after that flight. And all of these things can make that quite difficult. You mentioned as well, why don't we just fly quicker? Well, at the moment, we're somewhat limited by the aircraft and airframe capability. And I think until there's sort of significant developments in supersonic flight, then people are going to have to use their own individual coping techniques and methods that work for them. Hopefully that's given you a little bit of insight and answered your question.
Lindsay, thanks for some great strategies and answering the question about speed and the limitations that we have on that at the moment. I'm not sure about the skipping the post-flight chicken wing strategy. It doesn't really fit for me or work for me, but actually I do agree completely with you about trying to get back to a normal routine as soon as possible. Earlier this week I posted this video on YouTube. It was a video of an aircraft on approach that was struck in the windscreen by a bird. Now this video has been viewed probably about 250,000 times now and has actually brought up lots of questions from you about the survivability of aircraft during bird strikes of this nature. So what I've decided to do, rather than answer all of the questions individually, is to drop a little bit of knowledge on you about how aircraft are certified to survive bird strikes and how as pilots we can mitigate some of the bird strike risk as well. Many of you have likened this bird strike to that encountered by Captain Sully Sullenberger as he took his fateful flight over the Hudson and encountered a flock of Canada geese. Well, actually this is a very different circumstance. Thankfully the circumstance that was experienced by Captain Sullenberger and his crew on that morning is exceptional. They went into a large flock of Canada geese, ingested several, actually upwards of 30 in each engine it's estimated, and actually did this at a very low altitude of about 3,000 feet. So thankfully it is exceptional. And those are very rare occurrences. I can think of only one, which is that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on not that exceptional circumstance, but the more likelihood of hitting one or two birds on approach and how the engines and the aircraft are certified to withstand that. There is always going to be a hazard of striking birds. We have to share the sky with them. So how does aviation get around that risk? How does it mitigate it? Well, in two ways really. There's a certification way of mitigating it, and that accepts that we are going to hit birds, and we certify windscreens for bird impact, and we certify engines to be able to withstand a certain amount of bird ingestion. But there are other ways. So for example, flying at 250 knots below 10,000 feet, That's not just for sequencing on approaches, it's to reduce the kinetic energy of a potential bird strike, but also there are other ways. Many of you may have seen alternating flashing landing lights on aircraft, particularly on aircraft from Alaska Air. Well, actually, that's because they have a higher than normal bird risk because of flying around small islands and close to water where birds tend to migrate a lot, particularly in large flocks, and those flashing landing lights have been shown to scare the birds off, not unlike a flashing scarecrow type thing in a field. It has the same effect. Moving on now to the certification process for the engines and the windscreens. Well, this is actually tested in a really novel way. What they do is they get the engine or the windscreen in an artificial environment, they turn the engine on, get these huge cannons out, and what they do is they blast frozen chickens at the windscreen or the engine, as you can see here, at about 200 miles an hour. And the engine has to be certified to withstand a certain amount of this punishment. In this case, they've gone way beyond, and I think they put about 8 chickens through at once. This will just show you the survivability of the engine in this type of extreme bird strike. Ingesting a bird into an aircraft engine is unlikely to cause any major damage, but as you'll see here from this short video of a Thomson 757 departing Manchester Airport, it managed to suck up a bird in its right-hand engine. Now, whilst this looks exceptionally dramatic with flames and popping coming from the right-hand engine, in reality all that's happening here is something called a compressor stall, which is a backfire that you would get in your car. That popping sound is the engine backfiring. The way to resolve this is turn the engine off and start again. In the case of this aircraft, they decided not to turn it back on again and decided 20 minutes later to come back and land safely at Manchester. But the point I'm trying to make here is you can safely ingest the bird, deal with that problem, and the aeroplane will keep flying safely. We will always have to share the skies with birds, so I hope today has given you some reassurance that the aviation industry recognise that there is a threat that we can come into contact with birds, and through certification of the engines and the windscreens we've reduced that threat, and also through other measures like slowing down and having flashing landing lights we hope to avoid that threat completely. I hope it's been useful talking to you about these things, and I hope the threat of birds is not something you'll worry about when you go flying in the future. I have talked far too much about engines today and them ingesting birds, so let's talk a little bit about how conventional jet engines work. Back to a question, in fact, from Bob Reitz, and Bob has just asked that. He's asked, how do conventional jet engines produce thrust? Is it with the big fan on the front or the bit at the back? Well, I've asked Tamara Layton, a good friend of mine and fellow AvGeek contributor, to answer that question for Bob. Tamara.
Hi, I'm Tamara. I'm a commercial pilot and I'm going to be answering the question from Bob on jet engines and thrust. So thrust is created when air is expelled from the jet engine faster than when it entered the engine. There are 4 stages: air intake, compression, combustion and exhaust. A turbine-driven fan added to the front of a jet engine simply provides additional thrust by giving an initial compression to the intake air. The fan can handle a larger airflow volume than the compressor can, and this means that a fan design provides advantages such as allowing a better specific fuel consumption, a reduction in engine noise and a smaller engine size being required, amongst others. The compressor is made up of a number of blades, some of which are rotating and some of which are stationary. These compress the air. The compressed air is fed into the combustion chamber where fuel is added, and this is then ignited. The fuel-air mixture is controlled to get a continuous flame, and the hot gases are sent rearwards to exert a force on the turbine blades. These then spin the turbine. This in turn spins the shaft that is connected to the fan at the front of the engine. Therefore, as the air leaves the combustion chamber to spin the turbine, this in turn spins the fan, which draws in more air, resulting in the entire process starting again. The excess air from the combustor is then expelled from the back of the engine to produce thrust.
Thanks, Tamara. I'm a great believer that every day is a school day, and I've certainly learnt something today, and I hope everyone at home has as well. If you've really enjoyed it, then press the subscribe button below and get notifications next time we're up. And please join me in thanking all of our contributors today, both Lindsay and Tamara, by following them on their social media, the details of which are in the video description. That's all for now. So from this glorious afternoon in my garden, till the next time, goodbye.